I always think if I wanted to kill someone, I'd probably do it on stage because no one's really looking at me. So it's probably the best place to get away with something.
Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm thrilled, as always, to be here with you. And I'm particularly thrilled tonight because Mr. Bindig's back. How are you, sir?
Oh, man, I'm so happy to be back, David. It's been too long. You've been interviewing all these awesome keyboard players without me, and can I say, doing a fine job of it too. I've watched all your podcasts. They're awesome.
It's not the same without you, but I've survived just. So, no, it's great to have you back. And it doesn't get much more of a better time to have you back than our guest tonight. So we're really thrilled to have just finished a lovely chat with Mr. Doug Petty, who, saying he's the keyboard player with Tears for Fears is the understatement of the century, Paul, isn't it? Because that's just one tiny part of what he does.
Yeah, the hardest thing I found with that interview was working out what to leave out in asking him things, because he's worked with so many amazing artists over a long period of time, plus the film and the TV and all the rest of it. So, yeah, he's the keyboard player for Tears for Fears. That in itself would be amazing, but it's, as you said, David, it's a part of his career, not the whole of it.
Exactly. Yeah, so as you'll hear, Doug's an educator, an orchestrator, an arranger and a player. You'll hear about it all, and we'll be interested to see what you think, and we'll talk to you after the show. Doug, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I want to give you an award before you even open your mouth and say a word. I don't know anyone else that has gotten up at 5 a.m. to join us for a show, so for that alone, you are a winner. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, and I'm happy to be here. It's definitely a dedication to the podcast, and I'm glad to do it. I actually, in all honesty, I didn't really look at my email as well as I should have. I saw 5 and I thought 5 p.m. until yesterday, and then so I really had no choice. So, but happy to be here.
No, much appreciated. So, Doug, I thought we would start off before we cover your hugely diverse career, just talking about your musical upbringing. So what got Doug Petty into music originally? What was the kickoff for you?
Sure. Well, when I was young, I started playing piano at a young age. I have a brother who's a guitar player, so we would play in bands together, and we played a lot together. I was really fortunate early on to have a great teacher named Sandy Valerio, who really encouraged me and was just a phenomenal teacher, worked at the high school, also taught me privately, gave me the kind of encouragement that I needed, which I find is really huge for people who tend to be successful in this business. You have a teacher early on who was really, really helpful. And I was lucky to have that. And he encouraged me to pursue music and helped me get into college. I went to a music conservatory. I went to Eastman School of Music in Rochester, which was also a big boost for me. And it kind of started from there. Yeah, playing in bands, playing classical music, playing all kinds of things. And that's kind of been the template for my career ever since.
Absolutely. And the Eastman School of Music, it's a wonderful school with some amazing alumni. So tell us about what the biggest eye-openers were for you in learning music in that more formalized way.
Well, when I was in school, it's different than it is now, where at the time, there are very few, say, popular music programs. At the time, there's only maybe anything other than classical is really you study jazz. And at Eastman, I was really fortunate to study both classical music, a certain amount of arranging and orchestration, and jazz as well. So that was really, really great for me. And a school like that was really the foundations, really the basics. It was 4 years I was a classical performance major, which meant just completely classical, but I played in all the jazz ensembles. I got a chance to play jazz. That was really what I really loved to do. But I think I got a great education learning the basics in so many different and varied is within classical and jazz music.
Absolutely. And it's a shame you weren't 20 or 25 years older. Like you could have hung out with sort of Steve Gadd and Tony Levin and so on. I mean, there's some amazing people have come out of that school, which is great.
That's very, very true. Yeah, those guys were there together.
Oh, there you go. I didn't realize that. Yeah. Okay. Wow. There's a rhythm section.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned
right.
that you learned piano orchestration and arranging. Obviously, we're going to talk about your career as it developed. But of each of those, the piano orchestration and arranging, how have they each gelled for you or solidified for you throughout your career? Like, how have you managed to keep evolving all those three?
Well, it's interesting. Like I said, I was really trained as a classical pianist and then started playing jazz. So when I came out of school, I was really just playing piano. I moved to New York City. And, as soon as you get to New York City, you realize, well, there's not going to be a nice piano on every gig that you're on. So you have to kind of adapt. So I started playing more keyboards, which I was always interested in. But then I really started playing a lot of organ, a lot of Hammond B3 and that kind of thing. It made a lot more sense for what I was doing. Really got into vintage keyboards, playing things like, and I was doing things when I was in New York. I'd haul a Leslie around, a Hammond clone around, a Whirly, a clap. I mean, all this stuff for gigs in New York City, putting him in cabs, taking him out of cabs, all that stuff. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I keep changing. My career keeps changing, and how I handle my career keeps changing as I move forward, depending on where I am. So when I moved to New York, I was all about being a player, and I did that. I got some amazing opportunities that led me to be able to be an arranger and then a producer. And then now later on, I've started moving into the education area. You just kind of roll with what life brings you. It makes it interesting for that. I've always been interested in a lot of different things. And so to be able to keep pursuing those things makes the career interesting rather than just staying and doing one thing.
Yeah, Doug, you mentioned being an educator, and you're on the faculty at USC Thornton School of Music.
That's correct.
How has your formative years when you were at the Eastman School, how has that informed your approach as an educator now? Or what did you take away from that, and what do you apply now in your own education practice?
It's interesting. A school that I am at, the part of the school, and now at Thornton School, we have many different divisions. We have a classical division. We have a jazz division. But what I'm involved in is the popular music division. And within that, I work with kids in both production and popular music. So in popular music, they're really kind of learning to be players. They're learning how to be songwriters. And the producers are really just doing current, like really cutting edge production. So, I mean, one thing I think I learned a lot is this kind of sounds cynical, but I do talk about this with other professors, is that I had some incredible teachers when I was growing up, but things were a little bit different when I was in school, and the relationship between students and professors was a little bit different than it is now. So I try and keep that in mind all the time with, at Thornton School, it's a very, very small school. We know all the kids are able to develop close relationships with the professors. I never in a million years would have thought to come to one of my professors when I was in school and say, hey, you want to grab a coffee? Hey, do you want to do this? Let's talk about it. Can I just have some extra help? Can I just do this? I never would have done that. And these kids that I work with we do that all the time. There's no issues with that. And it's really about putting your ego aside, being there for the students. And I always try and keep that in mind. I think the more you go on as an educator, it's easy to lose sight of that type of thing. Yeah. And I think just, for me, I said before, my education was really great about these foundational basics. And I keep coming back to that as that's been really important for my education and my journey. And I always try, and whatever we are teaching, even though some of the things that I'm dealing with for students, I always try and distill it down to the basics and the fundamental aspects of what people need to be learning.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, so no whiplash moments for your students. It's a much nicer relationship. I think that's what you're saying.
I mean, they might have a different take on that, but I would say no.
So going back to your formative years and your student years, I'm assuming you're gigging maybe at the same time while you're studying as well. Would that be correct?
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, when I was in college, I had just great terrible gigs like people do. I had gig with a guy who must have been, 85 years old and a trumpet player who was probably 400 pounds. And we'd all, pile in his car, play these kind of, they don't have them, these things. They're basically American Legion halls, or like the veteran of foreign wars things for old people. And we'd play old standards and had to learn all these songs and had to get all these things together, which really, it's very funny to think about it now, but those gigs are very formative and they're very important when you're, say, 90 years old. I was lucky to have those types of things now.
What would you say, as a young man, was your first serious band or serious project that you really felt some passion for as you were starting to gig? Was that in your college years, or was it after you'd graduated?
It depends on, you mean by serious. I feel like we all do, you take everything seriously. No matter what you're doing, you might look back on it now and it might seem so insignificant or so silly, but at the time you take it really, really seriously. So I think everything I was doing in college I was taking it very, very seriously. And that seemed serious. My first big gig that I consider my first kind of turning point in my career, the first big one was, working with Shawn Colvin, which was a kind of, I started working with her just before she won the Grammy for Song of the Year and Record of the Year. But that was for me, my first kind of, big gig working with major players. And I got very, very fortunate to work with her, who I was a huge fan of, and the people in her band and the people she was working with, which I was kind of the young guy in the band and I was able to be brought in. And those things kind of help a lot in your career, moving you forward and kind of giving you kind of confidence and kind of breaking in a little bit, giving you a little bit of a name. But she was my first, kind of big gig, I would say.
Absolutely. And Shawn Colvin's amazing. So how did that progress from there, Doug, as far as you suddenly realize that you're making a whole career out of this? What sort of progressed on from Shawn?
Well, it's interesting with Shawn because I had been playing, in New York, and I'd worked with a lot of people. I'd already done, I'd done a lot of session scenes. I'd done movies. I'd done records for other people. But that was kind of my first, like I said, big gig. This is an interesting point in how things kind of just come up. I was working with Shawn. I was a player. At that point, I was really a player. I was really developed myself as a player. We had been on the road. We had been touring for about a year. She had won the Grammys and everything. The label wanted her to do another record to fulfill the contract. They wanted her to do a Christmas record, which she was not so crazy about. She's like, well, maybe I'll do some other thing. Anyway, out of the blue, basically, she asked me to produce the record, and I'd never produced a record before. I, of course, was like, yeah, of course. Yes, I'll produce this record. You jump in and you do these things. So basically, I produced this record for her that I still love. It's a little record called Holiday Songs and Lullabies. I don't mean little. I mean, it's just a small, intimate record that I still really love, this record. And then all of a sudden, you produce a record and then you're a producer. That's all it takes. You don't need a degree to be a producer. You just have to have produced a record. So I produced that record. But it's funny, when I was doing that record, I had lined up someone to do the string and the brass arrangements. We knew we wanted to make this kind of a really small record with some like string quartet, maybe brass quintet. So I lined someone else up to do it. Kind of at the last minute, he bailed on me. He couldn't do it. So I didn't know what to do. I was kind of young. I was pretty new. I really didn't know who else to call. And he just said, just do it. Just do it yourself. So I did all the arrangements on that record. And then all of a sudden, I'm an arranger. So it's the same kind of thing. That record led to really me being a producer and an arranger. And that's just kind of the way it goes in this business, isn't it? So all of a sudden the record was, I'm not going to say the record was, it wasn't like it was hugely successful or anything, but enough people knew that record and really liked that record. I will say, I'm not going to take so much credit. It's mainly because of her, but it really opened up a lot of doors for me.
It certainly did. And so I know it's hard for you to judge, Doug, but for Shawn to actually ask you to produce the album, she must have seen something. So what do you think she saw that made her think you could produce an album?
I think more than anything, probably we got along really, really well. Shawn and I have been friends for a number of years. And even early on in our career, I think we just had a really good working relationship. And I think she probably just felt like, well, if I'm going to do this, I'd rather do it with someone that, that I like and I get along with. The songs, a lot of the songs that this record was based on, we did one song for a Sting compilation and we kind of bonded over this love of this of this songbook by a composer named Alec Wilder that we both knew as kids. I think it just kind of worked out from there. And I think she wanted, if she was going to do a record like this, she wanted it to be interesting. I'm sure she thought she'd rather take a chance on someone blowing it than just make a generic kind of thing with someone that wasn't that interesting.
And so what was the bridge for you from moving from Shawn to other touring gigs? And I'm actually not sure from a sequence viewpoint where Tears for Fears fits in, but just what was the bridge there for you to now going, well, I'm touring regularly with a range of different acts?
Yeah, it's funny because, I jump around with so many different things. I was working with Shawn at the same time I was working on Britney Spears' first record. So we were doing that in the studio, which was really a different time. I was working with Shawn, and it was the Lilith Fair time. So the things that were on the radio were just like, it was Shawn, it was Sheryl Crow, it was Sarah McLachlan. That was the stuff that was very, very popular at the time in the studio doing a record with Britney. And I remember thinking like, yeah, okay, this is never going to come out. This is never going to go anywhere. This is like, this is nothing. And then all of a sudden, Britney's record comes out and it's just massive. It's just the biggest thing ever. And then it's like Britney and NSYNC and that kind of singer-songwriter thing that we all thought would go on forever, which was great for us musicians. Everyone loved playing that kind of serious-based music. Fell out of favor as opposed to how it had been leading up to that. All of a sudden I kind of get a little bit known for this, he played on Britney Spears record. Those things go a long way. It doesn't matter kind of what you do so much. He played on Britney. Now, I didn't work with Max Martin. I didn't do any of those tracks, but people don't really think about that. They just think, he played on that record and that record's big. So let's call that guy. Shawn took some time off and I started working with Enrique Iglesias. So then, and that kind of background of having played with Britney worked in my favor towards working with Enrique, which was great. And I was able to work on and off with him for a number of years. As far as Tears go, I had already been working in a band with Kurt Smith from Tears for Fears before I really started working with Shawn. Actually, the Tears for Fears had been broken up for a number of years. Kurt was living in New York, and Kurt and I and Charlton Pettis, the producer of the band and longtime co-writer and songwriter, Charlton and I had a band together. This is going to end up being such a long-winded story, but yes, he started writing with Kurt. So we all started putting it together, and we had this band called Mayfield, and as a play on Kurt is Mayfield, Curtis Mayfield. That was the thing. So Mayfield was our band, and it's Kurt's solo record, and so we were doing that for a long time. And this was then years later. Kurt moved to L.A. Charlton moved to L.A. I eventually ended up moving to L.A. And then Tears for Fears got back together, and then we all started working in Tears for Fears. And then over 20 years later, we started working together. When we started working together, Kurt and Charlton and I, none of us were married. None of us have children. And now I think my kids are the youngest out of all our kids who graduated college, basically. We're all married. We've been doing this for a long time together. So there's quite a history there. Even though I feel like I came into Tears for Fears much later on in the process, I wasn't there for the beginning. So I feel like I came in later, and it's still kind of, a big chunk of my life. So.
Yeah, well, Tears for Fears is a big deal for many music fans, and I can assure you they're a big deal in this country too. Very, very popular, as I know you would have experienced touring around with them.
Sure.
And I'm fascinated to understand, Doug, for you touring on that scale with such a popular band, big stages, big keyboard rig, a lot going on. Was there any learning curves for you in terms of wrangling all of that to get the sound just right?
Working with those guys is definitely a challenge. Those records were made painstakingly. It's not like just go in the record. I'm sure you've heard these stories about, the way these records were made. It was weeks and months just getting a drum fill or just getting a keyboard sound. And, the keyboard sounds especially, that was really, it was mainly Roland. He's got his fingerprint on every single thing that's happened on every one of those sounds. So when I came in as a keyboard player, it's not one of those gigs where it's, just do your thing, add your own thing to it. It's very much like, this is what I did, and this is what the song is, and let's do it like this. And when I started, it was a lot more difficult to really recreate those sounds because there wasn't main stage, so to do this stuff live, I'm not a big fan of going on the road and bringing a lot of vintage gear that's going to kind of fall apart. I've done that a lot. I used to do that in bands in New York. And that's one thing when you have control. But when you're on the road, unless you have a backup of every single keyboard, it's just not really going to work. So at the time when I was putting together 20 years ago, there wasn't the emulation of vintage gear was not what it is now as far as using keyboards. So it was I had a huge rack full of gear that, I was programming, and to change a sound, you had to go in and just use the buttons and the knobs and all that stuff. And it was, every time you had to make a change, it was crazy. And I just went through all these different iterations of different gear to try and get it right. Everything. I remember I was using the Muse receptor. I was one of the first guys using the receptor. That was going to be a game changer. It never quite took up. It's a lot easier now. Things are a lot easier and a lot more streamlined now, although I do use a pretty big rig. But it's much easier to control it. Putting it together in the beginning was a challenge. And it's been a long, long road to get to where we are now.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'd love, if you don't mind, Doug, a quick rundown of your rig. I've watched videos over the last couple of years, and you've got a U-shaped rig. You've got keyboards on both the left and right and ahead of you. And as you mentioned, I mean, Roland, I'm assuming, did Roland, sorry, as the first question, did he have stuff written down? Because I know you know this. He used Fairlights heavily. I just can imagine he must have kept some sort of notes on how he created some of the sounds so you had something to work from.
No, I mean, well, so one thing I had to work from was when we just started, he had and it's a very cool thing that I have this stuff. He had all the original, the master tapes bounced down to Logic files. So I have the breakouts of everything. So some of the stuff and some of the stuff now, it's easier to sample some of that stuff than it is to kind of recreate it, to get it exactly how it is. So yeah, so he had that. He didn't have it written down necessarily what he used, but he knew, he can tell you, oh yeah, that was a DX1. The DX1 was big in that, some of that early stuff. The Fairlight, of course. And some of that stuff, the Fairlight stuff, the sequency stuff, some we put on track and, some I just play. When we started out, the track thing was a lot more dodgy too than it is now. So it was really good for me. And I've always been a fan of this. Early on in that gig, I decided I wanted to play as much as possible. I want to play everything I possibly can. And it's to the point where it's maybe a little ridiculous, where it's just like two hands and I'm playing everything and moving around. I will say, as a keyboard player, it's very important, because a lot of times an artist or an MD will say, oh, let's just put that on track. We can just put that on track. It's okay. And maybe when you're putting together a gig for the first time, you think, okay, cool, I don't have to worry about that. But as you've been doing the gig for a long time, that can get boring. So I think it will behoove anyone to play as much as possible early on, so you have that, so it keeps being a challenge and it keeps being interesting.
So tell us the rig that you do use on stage, because, from watching the videos, you work hard, as you've just mentioned. Tell us about the rig that you actually use.
Yeah. Okay. So I've been really, really far. I have this great relationship with Roland, who has been really, not Roland Orzabal. I have a great relationship with Roland Orzabal, but also Roland, the keyboard company, has been really great with me. And they have been very, very helpful with giving me a lot, supplying me with what I need for keyboards and stuff. So I use, my main keyboard controller is an RD2000, the Roland, which is a great controller. And I'll say, let's see, it started setting this up. So I use that with Mainstage. And I'm using, I do use Mainstage a lot. I have Mainstage set up to be my kind of central hub for everything, but I'm able to control everything on the RD2000. So I can just go, I'm not actually controlling, like pressing a button. I never touch the computer. I just have it all set up so I can scroll through patches on the RD2000 that controls my whole rig. So everything is all set up together and everything is all interfaced together. So I have the RD2000 and I have Mainstage. I have if you've ever seen the thing a lot. I had this case made, and it looks like a Rhodes case, but the RD2000 lives in the Rhodes case. I just think it's a better look on stage. I like the legs of it and everything. It just looks really cool, but it's an RD2000. It's not an actual Rhodes. And on top of that, I've been using the Roland, the VR909 for organ. I believe it's the 909. It's the organ, the clone. I used a Korg CX3 for many, many years, which is great. And the key to that is the 909. The key is I use a ventilator with that. I used to always on the road, even I used to bring a Wurlitzer out and a Leslie, but that gets, I think in the big picture, when you're out in the audience, it's really hard to tell the difference between a real Leslie and the ventilator for 99% of people. And it's definitely a bigger deal for our sound guys not to have to deal with a Leslie. So that helps. So I use that. So the RD2000 and the Roland on top. To the left of me, I have to the right of me, I'll also have a System 8. And then I have a Jupiter 80 that I use for a lot of stuff. And then a Jupiter X as well. So it's admittedly, it's a little overkill. I love having a lot of keyboards. I love having a big keyboard rig. I mean, growing up, I was just such a fan of Rick Wakeman and Tony Banks and, all these guys with big keyboard rigs. So it's just, I like having a lot of it. I also like being able to, since everything is all controlled, when I change a patch, everything changes. I just, I love to be able to have one sound on one keyboard and another sound on another keyboard. And I know where that goes. And it's, it's really easy to do. So the big rig, as much as I love if you're going to be on tour and someone else is setting up your gear, you might as well bring out a lot of keyboards, so I love, I really like that. I really love it. It's a great thing to do. And I have that all kind of dialed in, but yes, the setup's been different over the years. It's been evolving. I like this setup right now, but what I do have and what I always have set up is the RD2000 and the organ on top. I kind of set this up as a kind of a fail-safe thing. I just do this on every gig. If it all goes to shit, if something goes wrong, I have basically the organ that's always just acting as an organ, and I can always just use the outputs and just use the RD2000 as a piano. I mean, on any gig you do, if you have a piano and an organ, you can basically do anything. Even with Tears for Fears, which is a heavy synth gig and stuff, I could get through that whole gig just with piano and organ, and it would be like, okay, it's fine. But I bet you 98% of people would not know the difference. So, and I think that's most gigs, if you have a couple things that you're comfortable with, so it'll take some of that worry out when you're on stage with all this stuff going on.
Yeah, you're probably right. And you're right. It looks cool to have a big keyboard rig around you, especially playing big stages with a big band. So I reckon that's, as you said, particularly if someone else is setting it up for you, why wouldn't you do it? Mm-hmm. Fantastic. I saw a post you put on Doug, which was you, I assume, from the stage at Madison Square Garden, and there's a sign that says, welcome to Madison Square Garden, Tears for Fears. Yeah. Can you try and talk us through what it feels like to be a New Yorker playing a big show on that stage to a packed house? It must be incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely pretty great. I've played Madison Square Garden a few times now in my career, and I think whenever you play somewhere that you're a hometown person. When I was growing up, I grew up in Long Island, so the idea of Madison Square Garden was always, I mean, it's huge for anyone. Madison Square Garden is big. You think of Zeppelin, you think of all these different bands. It's, Madison Square Garden is massive, but if you're from there, it's like if you grew up in London and you're playing Royal Albert Hall. It's big. So it definitely makes an impact on you, and you don't really forget about that kind of thing when you're in there. You don't really take it for granted.
Absolutely. And you Royal Albert Hall. I just wanted to briefly mention, Doug, the United Kingdom. I know you did a wonderful gig on the BBC's Piano Room where it was essentially you on grand piano working with Roland and Curtis, and you obviously did the orchestration for that. So that's obviously an example of where your orchestration skills came into being. But what was involved in getting ready for that, and what was the collaboration like with Roland and Curtis to make that happen?
let's see, as far as the collaboration goes, it was really like, okay, we have this thing coming up and they want to do this thing, the piano room, which I hadn't been familiar with. And I think some people do it just piano and vocals. And I guess there was an option to do with a chamber orchestra. So it was just, let's do that. I'd done some strings on some other records. And so basically I did it like I do most things. When I do an arrangement for an artist, I will work out the arrangement. We knew we wanted to do some things differently. It's always more interesting to kind of do your own take on arrangement, try and make it kind of special. I will lay it down and I will kind of mock everything up with the strings and I'll do the whole arrangement and mock it up so I can give it to the artists first. They were in all different places, so I didn't have access to them. I had to take vocals from different places, old vocal takes, and kind of slow them down and make them work with the arrangement. But I was able to give them things of, okay, this is my thought. This is what it's going to be. Between not having a lot of time, pretty much right away, there wasn't too much to say. It wasn't a whole lot of back and forth, but it also wasn't a lot of, it wasn't like, showing up at the BBC and hearing this for the first time or doing this for the first time. We all, they were aware and we kind of got together on it. I'm sure that they had more input on these than I'm giving them credit for right now, as I remember. But it did go pretty quickly. So yeah, it's one of my favorite things to do is take pieces like that, take interesting things and kind of change them around and kind of make them my own. Yeah, we showed up. We were all kind of jet lagged. The parts were all good, and we were there early in the morning and kind of played it down one time, and it worked out and had a really, really good performance. There's always been talk about doing a whole record of that type of thing, but I think we'd have to have a whole album's worth of material. We'd have to put get some more time on it and really make it special. Those guys aren't into releasing anything just for the sake of releasing it.
No, absolutely. And so I'm really interested on that aspect. Like a lot of keyboard players, and we've interviewed many players who work for, iconic artists like Roland and Curtis in Tears for Fears, and they obviously have their vision. The vision is well established. It sounds like you certainly have some leeway to reinterpret things for things like BBC Piano Room, but it sounds like you have the trust of both of them. But what is it like working with what is rightly demanding band leaders who have a vision? I mean, what sort of skills do you need to bring to make that work well?
Well, I think it's the same as you would bring to any artist, really. I mean, of course, if you're an established kind of musician, you're working with a new artist, that's one set of skills, because I think generally a new artist will be counting on you to bring your experience to what they work with an established artist. I think you have to know when to kind of step out and show what you can do, and also know when to kind of set back and kind of be in the background. I think that's those kind of attributes as a musician are the kind of thing that's going to keep you working. I've seen many, many people in this business lose gigs and not go along in their career because they've made it way too much about, especially early on, and not know where that line is. But it can be tough to know sometimes, People you hear a lot about as a musician, you have to be assertive, you have to put yourself out there, you have to be so involved, but there is a line, there's a point. How often do you post on social media that you're doing this, or how often do you do this thing? That's not always great for the artist, and you have to know how to walk that line. I don't know if I've ever known how to walk it, but I think my temperament is that of a kind of behind the scenes guy who's happy to be back there, regardless. So it's worked out fairly well for me. I always feel bad when I meet, especially keyboard players, I think, who really want to be guitar players, but are keyboard players, but they're kind of frustrated frontmen. And I think, that must be so difficult for you, because you're never going to have that, because we're keyboard players, no matter what you do, you're in the back. I always think if I wanted to kill someone, I'd probably do it on stage, because no one's really looking at me. So it's probably the best place to get away with something. And I think as keyboard players, we can understand that. But this is probably the only podcast where I can say something like that, where maybe someone listening to it would understand that.
It's so true.
Yeah, it's true.
Everyone
And
listening will understand that. They will understand it. Yeah.
yeah, I think so. So if the sooner you can get comfortable with that idea, the better off you will be.
So, innate understanding of the fact that I'm here to support the music, serve the artist, as you said, trying to, I'll use your word, Doug, the line, trying to understand where the line is around. I'm assertive, but I'm part of a team. Do you feel that that's helped you move from, as someone who was at school doing classical performance and into the world of pop with a relatively easy transition? Do you think that helped you there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is definitely an ego thing, and I work in so many different areas with, I work with artists who, like you said, super pop to kind of singer songwriter to when I'm working on a project or when I'm doing anything that I'm working on, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a K-pop thing or a boy band thing or whatever. You're not slumming it or looking down on it. When you're doing a job, you're just doing the best job. I've had this conversation with a few engineer friends of mine, and we kind of all have the same answer. Sometimes people say, "Oh, do you like that music? How do you even do that? Are you into this?" It's like, well, yeah, I'm into this. This might be not what I'm going to listen to, what I'm going to put on when I choose to listen to music, but when I'm working on it, I'm 100% into it, and I'm going to do the best job within the parameters of what I'm doing. And I think that's just, I think most of us as musicians, that's what we do. When we're going to always do a good job, sometimes at our detriment. And sometimes I think people take advantage of that as musicians. They know no matter what, you're always going to show up. You're always going to do a good job. You're going to do your best. As a musician, most of the time, you can't do anything but your best. But yeah, so we're always kind of doing that regardless of the style, regardless of the genre.
Yeah, well, that's such a great professional attitude. And let's be honest, pop artists, they're no joke. And maybe what we'll do, Doug, is you've worked with so many great artists over a long and successful career. But if you'll indulge us, we might pick 3 or 4, and maybe just get a few thoughts from you on what it was like working with them, or you can share a story of working with them. And speaking of pop artists who are no joke, I'm going to start with Rihanna, who I believe might be the second best female selling artist of all time. So definitely no joke. What was that like?
Well, it was great for me. I worked with her earlier in her career, and I did not have a lot of interaction with her. We did a big performance for the American Music Awards, and her Umbrella had just come out. And it didn't just come out. It was a big hit. She had this big performance at the American Music Awards, and they wanted to do a different take on it. So I did this arrangement of Umbrella that started out with just string quartet, and it sounded very kind of 20th century modern. And it was just her and a string quartet, and then the curtains opened up, and it reveals the whole orchestra doing the rest. And it goes into a more traditional version of it, but she loved it, and it was very successful. And then she came out there, did a duet with Neo, and it turned into a whole thing. But it was great, and I still show my students that video, and they all, someone like Rihanna is always big enough, so it's always really interesting to see that stuff. But she was great. I wish I had more stories about her. I don't, other than the fact that she was just, lovely to work with, but I didn't get a chance to work with her specifically on the arrangement. That was another one of those things where it was basically done, and then everyone was happy. So
exactly, doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah.
So, what about Backstreet Boys, Doug? What was the involvement there?
Yeah, with that, I worked with a friend of mine, Eric Foster White, who's a producer, who also worked on a lot of the Britney stuff. And with the Backstreet Boys, honestly, that was years ago. I really just play some piano, I think some keys as well as that goes. So yeah, that was just session work coming in as a session player. Back then it was still more, we were still jumping around to studios more often than we are now. Like, oh, will you come in and play piano on this, in the studio, go to Sony or something and play piano on this. Now there's, much, as we all know, there's much less of that. A lot of it is, will you play the piano on this? Here, I'll send you the track, and then send it back to me. Where I see that more you still see that with film music, but less of it with pop music, of going in the studio to do, to play actual keys on something.
No worries. And then the third one of our four that we want to ask you about is G.E.M. So the amazing Chinese singer G.E.M. How did that one come about?
So G.E.M, I've been working with G.E.M for years. I've worked on every record that G.E.M's done. She early on in her career, I met her producer Lupo Groenig, who's just a phenomenal composer. He's Austrian, but was living in Hong Kong, and he kind of signed her and developed her. And we became friends and had a working relationship. And so, yeah, I developed and programmed and played piano and string arranging and all that stuff. And we worked really closely. I would say I probably worked. I mean, it's funny to think now of all the work we've done, all the songs, all the records that we've done for that stuff. But we worked very, very closely on that. And now they're not working together, but I'm still working with G.E.M. I did her last record, so she'll call me to do. I did strings for her last record. We did, I think, four strings. We actually did those in Prague. I think that was a lot. Usually we do strings, everything with her. We do it in Hollywood, which I like to do. But the last one we did remote, which I'm not a huge fan of doing remote string stuff. It has its place, but yeah, so working with her has been amazing. And she's really then turned into, I think when I met her, she may have been 15 or 16 or something when she started. And, now she's turned into a force of nature on her own. She's producing her own stuff and really knows what she wants. So that's been an interesting thing to be a part of from the beginning. But it's another one of those things you look back on and you just think of, wow, I can't believe we've done all of this. The amount of the content there's so much of it. But yes, I owe that all to Lupo Groenig, who's just, really a force. He's another one of those guys who doesn't let things slide in a good way. He keeps me on my game. I think I do find that it's funny. Sometimes you have collaborations with people that you work with, and we would always be working back and forth mainly. He would be in Hong Kong. I'd be here. He'd send me some initial stuff. I'd send it back. He'd send it back with notes, and his notes were always not just written notes. He'd send these audio files of him talking and discussing, and you'd go through all this stuff. When we actually did the sessions, like string sessions, he'd come here to LA and we'd do them, and we'd do a lot in one day. So it was very, very important it really helped me get my arranging together and get everything together. You have all these players and you have a lot to get through in one day. There's a lot of money on the line. So you have to be really right on. There can't be any mistakes. And so that really helped a lot with that. But you do see sometimes working with, when you have a great working relationship with someone who kind of makes you better. And I know with him, my stuff with him is better because stuff that I will say, oh, that's good, right? We're good. We got that. That's okay. He'll say, no, you got to go back and look at that again. And I do find that's helpful when it's the right person. You both are on the same page. So yeah, so that's been an amazing person to work with.
Yeah, high standards are a good thing. And speaking of high standards, our fourth artist we'd love to ask you a little bit about is Celine Dion.
Yeah, again, I wish I had more to say about that. That was just some session work, just going in and playing some keys. Yeah, I wish I had more. I think, she's amazing. I wish I had been in the studio with her or that kind of thing, but it was just getting called on to play. So many of these things, so many of the things that are on your resume are just, I played on that, didn't I? Or something, I did some stuff, you get called in. So I think I got called after the fact and played keys, played piano, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it speaks volumes for you that you're the guy getting the call, right? So that's still an amazing thing. And I also would like to just touch on your extensive work you've done in film and TV. So you've got a lot of credits when it comes to and really well-known popular shows and movies that people will know. Tell us about how that came into being and how that's evolved for you over time. And are you still doing much of that work?
Yeah, I am. That's part of the training of the class where the classical training has really come in handy. Playing film score stuff. When you go in and do a film and you're the pianist and you go in and there's a stack of music on the piano and there's a 90-piece orchestra and it's basically, okay, we're going to start at, 1M1. They'll call it the first one. They put it up and you read it down one time basically. And then You record it the next time, and that's it. We're moving on to 2M2. So you can't make a mistake, and your sight reading has got to be really, really good, especially as a pianist, I think, or a percussionist or something. If you make a mistake, everyone's going to know who it is. If you're a violinist, you're one of 40 violinists, and you make a mistake, well, maybe no one's going to know exactly who that is, but there's a lot of pressure on you for those things. So that in the classical training really came in handy. And I love that stuff. I love doing that stuff. I love the pressure of it. I love that. I've been, that like sight reading. I like all that kind of thing. So I think that's really comes in handy. I mean, that really took off for me when I worked I was still in New York at the time, and I was doing a lot of session work, but I got the opportunity to work with John Powell, who is just a phenomenal film composer. And it was pretty early on in his career. And we did a film called 2 Weeks Notice. A lot of times when you go in and you work with a film composer, the composer's written music, and you go in and you play the music, and it's like, great. Okay. That's excellent. You don't necessarily always get a chance to really show what you can do. I got really lucky on 2 Weeks Notice because John had written this score that had just some beautiful kind of sensitive piano stuff, but then he also needed B3. He needed Hammond B3 on it. There are some sections where he needed me to like, oh, can you do a thing like kind of stride piano here and kind of improvise this kind of thing? And so it was just really, really fortunate that I was able to do all the stuff that I happened to be able to do. And he and I got on very well, and he appreciated that. He was one of the big reasons I moved to LA, actually. He said, oh, you should, with your skill set, you should move to LA. And a number of different people had been saying that around the time. And I did end up making the move to LA. Everything was pointing towards that being a good idea at the time. When you move somewhere and people tell you to move somewhere, they say, oh, move to LA, call me, definitely call me. And when you move to LA, and when you do that, you find out that when you call people, most of the time they don't call you back and they don't remember any of that stuff. But John was one of those rare people who I called him as soon as I moved to LA. And as soon as I did, he started calling me for work. And it was very, very fortunate. The scene, getting into the session scene as far as the film and TV thing in LA is very, very closed. And it's very, very difficult to get into. And if you have someone like John saying, call this guy, put this guy in the gig, he kind of got me into that whole scene. And that was incredibly helpful. Again, another one of those lucky situations, kind of being on the right session at the right time with the right person. And it just led to different things. And so it's led to playing on a lot of different films.
I have to ask you, Doug, when you're playing on an animated film, such as a Frozen or a Happy Feet, so listeners and viewers, I said he played on some pretty important, pretty big films. Music heavy, and the time from the germination of the film to the release is, it's quite a long lag time before these films hit the cinema. Do you sit in the cinema when you go and watch the film and sit back there and go, that sounds great, that's me playing on that? Do you have that moment sort of a couple of years later afterwards?
Yeah, I'd say even, sometimes you'll see something will come around on TV or something like that. You'll forget, that you've maybe played on it or something like a session. And it's, oh, right. And maybe there's a little moment. Yeah, I will say so many of the things you play on, like when you're playing with an orchestra, usually they'll do the orchestra plus piano a lot of times, but it's the strings, harp, and piano they'll record. And then maybe they'll have the brass separately and the percussion separately. So that's how they'll record, not always, but typically that'll happen. So, if you're playing a piano with a lot of orchestral stuff, you don't necessarily hear the piano unless it's a, kind of a solo section. So for a lot of things, and then by the time the dialogue's in and everything's in, a lot of times you don't, it's pretty, a part that you maybe will have sweated over and it will be a big deal when you're in the studio and you think, oh, this is going to be amazing when it comes out. When it comes on the screen, it's just kind of a blip and it happens really quickly and it's under dialogue maybe. So you don't hear it as much as you think you would. Yeah, I mean, it's always, it's always pretty interesting when you do then come out, when you hear something in the theater, you hear something interesting. And then I think it's always more, I mean, I'm always that guy who sticks around when they don't always put your name in the credits as a musician. It seems every other person in the movie gets their name in the credit no matter what they do. But musicians, a lot of the times, they do not. Some composers, like John, usually goes out of his way to put musicians' names in the credits, and you'll see. So that's always fun. I think that's even more fun. I'll stick around to the end to see my name in the credits.
I wonder if your daughters thought Dad was cool when Frozen came out because you played on that. Is that a...
No, I think they're coming around to think it's cool now. My daughters now are 21 and 19. They would have been just around their right age for Frozen, but at the time when it came out, they were too young. Frozen or even like Happy Feet and all that stuff, but they were too young to really know what was like appreciate it, to understand. Right, that dad played on that, or it's you can't really. Is Dad in the movie? Did he? What is that? Yeah, you can't really explain that to a 5-year-old. So yeah, most of my career, my daughters have been very unimpressed, as they should be.
Yes, that's right, absolutely, and I think that's as common as keyboard players not being seen. I agree. I want to ask you a question, Doug, before we jump into our final few, and that is, going back to your role as a teacher, now, given the advent of AI and obviously some of the music applications of AI are starting to come to the fore, what are you thinking you're going to be teaching students wanting to make a career in music about how to keep music human? How do we make sure it stays human and albeit use AI as tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think as musicians, we've been using AI as tools for a long time, haven't we? We've been going through this. I mean, certainly with all the tools that we use, there's been AI. And I think we're just going to have more of that. I think what AI is going to take more of the low-hanging fruit for music. I mean, I do a lot of production music, and I think we'll see a lot of that kind of work, or maybe income from that type of work go away. Stuff that's maybe just played under a commercial or under something. Those things just, it's kind of cyclical, isn't it? Those things go away. When I started out in the business, you still needed to have a bunch of guys go into a room to record a jingle, and they'd get paid union scale or something like that. That hasn't been the case in a long time. So we move on from there. And I think even with this, like production music, we've seen over the past few years, there was a time where you'd make money doing production music. And now with streaming, we're not really seeing any money in that anyway. AI might take over that. I don't really see it taking over the human element of making music. I think it's just a basic human thing that we're all going to be interested in. People want to make music. People want to, it's something that's always been happening that people are interested in. So the more advanced that AI gets in their ability to make music, the more the music that actual people make is going to change. I mean, I think we're going to see a response to the music that is made by humans that will just continue to be more and more interesting. I do feel like in pop music for the last number of years, the trend has been for people to make music that sounds like robots a little bit. And I know that sounds a little cynical to say, but we've been kind of going towards that type of thing. And I think we're going to get away from that. I think if anything, I think it might be more interesting for musicians, the music that we're going to hear. People are going to be more interested in, even your average person is going to be more interested in hearing live type music that can't be done by machines. So I have decided to take a glass half full look at AI rather than the glass half empty. So that's my take on it. I'm sticking with that take.
Yeah, I think that's a great take, Doug. And I think you're right. The human aspect of music can't be beaten, particularly in the live environment. And it doesn't get much more human when you're playing gigs than something going wrong. One of our common questions, Doug, is a train wreck. Has there been a notable train wreck where things have gone spectacularly wrong and you can look back and laugh about it now?
It's funny because I saw that in your email and I was trying to think about what has gone spectacularly wrong. Okay, one part of me, I'm one of those guys who just I'm so anal about having backups and having everything kind of, to prepare myself for the worst situation, that things don't tend to go really wrong that often. I also expect them to go wrong so often. So I couldn't think of a great story. I mean, at the same time, there are things that happen like that just all the time. You get on stage at a big show like in the Forum, and, you know, your in-ears aren't working, or one person's in-ears aren't working, or the monitors go out, or the keyboards go down right in the middle of something, or main stage goes out. I mean, that's one of those things that just happens all the time. So it's not even spectacular. I mean, and then, there are these little things. I mean, I have this, when I play, I'm sitting down half the time and I'm standing up some of the time. So I do have a stool, and I had a guy who was a backline guy who hadn't been on for a long time. He just didn't adjust the stool, and I went to sit down. I just fell down, fell off the riser, fell off the whole thing. It was a complete mess. But this is to my point of, like, I don't think anyone noticed. It's like it was only me who really noticed this whole thing. It was terrible. I felt like it was awful. So that's kind of that point. I mean, but there's been so many situations on these big gigs. But as a keyboard player, especially more, I guess probably anyone, I say as a keyboard player because we're all keyboard players, but just expecting those terrible things to happen. I wish I had a better, crazy, terrible story of something going wrong. And I'm sure that I will think of it right as soon as we finish this podcast. But that's about that's the soonest, the closest one I can think of.
Well, it probably speaks to exactly what you said, your preparedness for the fact that things inevitably will go wrong, especially when we've got complexity in our setup. So just rolling with it and making it work is key, right? Now, the other question we love to ask all our guests, and it's a really hard one to answer, is our Desert Island Discs question, which is, what are the 5 albums you would take with you on that desert island? Have you had a chance to think about that, Doug?
I did think about this. This is a terrible question. It's a terrible, terrible question. It's like 5 discs, because how do you, okay, can I give you a few and then we can pare it down? I actually wrote some down because I thought about this last night.
Yeah, go for it.
But there are some that I couldn't. Okay, so
absolutely.
If literally desert island, you need something that's going to be, so the 80s, when I say 80s, you're going to think it's a different record that I'm talking about, but the Glenn Gould, Goldberg variations, the one he did in the 80s, I would definitely take that, because that's going to be, you're just going to get so much, and it's just, it's great. Either recording that he did is great, but I tend to like the later one better. And then you get into things like, how do you even choose in certain records? Like I'll say, I mean, just Steely Dan alone, Gaucho. Can I do Gaucho and the Night Fly? Like those two, and one's not even Steely Dan, one's, but I don't want them to count for two. Those have to just be kind of like those combined. And then one of my all-time favorite records is Billy Preston, Encouraging Words. So that's just a perfect kind of incredible record. But then going along with that, like on the organ side, Jimmy Smith, Organ Grinder Swing. So those two records maybe together. 2 records that I think of together, Abbey Road and then Dark Side of the Moon. Like those are kind of 2 in that era. Aretha live at the Fillmore, Donny Hathaway live, and B.B. King live at the Regal. Those 3 would make a good kind of live thing. And, I know I'm giving away too many records. I know this is not just 5, but then maybe Peter Gabriel's So. I love that record. So I could go on like this all day. I mean, there's so many records I could.
It was. In the 80s, Doug, record companies used to bundle 2 different albums into a double cassette. So we'll just treat it as 5 promo double cassettes with 2 different albums on each. That's fine.
Okay. Good. I appreciate that. It's hard. It's like putting records that you care about so much. You're just choosing 5. I feel like I'm leaving so many artists out. I'm leaving so many important things out. It's a difficult one. It's interesting though. It is. It's probably a good, exercise to kind of look at and
is good.
Think, okay, what's really important to you? What is, where do you really stand?
No, good intellectual exercise. And the last question, Doug, before we let you go, is tagging a keyboard player. So is there another keyboard player, pianist, organist, composer out there that you admire that you'd love to hear more about their story?
Well, someone I work with is who I just admire to know, and is Patrice Rushen. I don't know if you guys have talked to Patrice yet.
No, I haven't.
I work with Patrice over at Thornton School, and she's just unbelievable. I mean, not just a great keyboard player, piano player, arranger, writer, but also an amazing editor, and she speaks so eloquently about everything. So she would be a great person to have on your podcast. So I would definitely recommend Patrice. Yeah.
Great pick. Thank you. And speaking of amazing educators, I feel like you fall within that description as well, Doug, amongst your many other achievements. We can't thank you enough for taking the time. Your career is nothing short of stellar and has a long way to go. And we look forward to watching that progress. And hopefully we get you down under at some stage, whether it's with Tears for Fears or in some other guys.
Yeah, that'd be phenomenal. And thanks for having me on this. I really appreciate it. And I just love that you guys are doing this. You know, it's one thing you expect these things for drummers or for guitar players or stuff, but I think, you know, this is a very specific niche thing for keyboard players. So I love to see that you're doing this. It's great.
And there we have it. As we said at the start, Doug's had one hell of a diverse career, and it was an absolute pleasure speaking with him, Paul.
It sure was. I really loved his humility, although he's done all these amazing things, you know, and he really made that point about you're there to work for the artist, and when I'm working on this project, it's the most important thing for me. And I loved those messages that we took away from that chat.
Absolutely. So, no, he had lots to impart, and I've certainly valued it a great deal. So, huge thanks to Doug again for his time today, and particularly at 5 a.m. So, I feel so bad.
Yeah.
But, I really appreciate him taking the time. So, a big thank you to all of you out there, as always, for listening as well. We're want to give a shout out to our gold and silver supporters. So, to the musicplayer.com forums, Dave and the team there. The forums have been around since the early 2000s. They're still a go-to place if you want to talk keyboards. Highly recommend them. To Mike at midnightmastering.com if you're creating your own work and need a well-priced but high-quality mixing and mastering solution. Mike is the guy at midnightmastering.com. And a huge shout-out, as always, to Tammy Catcher from Tammy's Musical Stew. If you love great curated shows covering different genres and themes, that's the place to go. And that's pretty much it for our gold and silver supporters. And our biggest supporters are obviously you that listen each and every time, particularly Joe, who's probably the only person listening about now. We'll be back in a matter of a week or two. And until then, keep on playing.